Welcome to another episode of Prime and Load. Originally, when I thought about doing a Halloween episode, I can't say I was overly optimistic that we could find enough interesting topics that would fit into our topic and our time period. But as usual, Alex and Andrew delivered. Today's episode, we're going to talk about 18th century French monsters, Eastern European vampires, and Hessian UFOs. My name is Lee Cagino, and I'm joined by Drs. Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. Thank you for joining us for Prime and Spook. So it's the 29th today, in a few days is Halloween, and we've got some ghost stories from the 18th century. So I think we'll do this kind of in a almost around the campfire sort of format. I think, Alex, you said you were going to go first.
So I think as Americans, when we think about Halloween, it's not just necessarily a matter of ghost stories, but sort of the paranormal, kind of broadly spooky that we sort of picture in this time of the year, sort of the mass marketing holiday version maybe of this time of the year. And one of those sort of paranormal or otherworldly events in American history for us is the Salem witch trials. Now, of course, there are witch trials all throughout early modern Europe and in North America long before this, from the 1500s kind of on. But for Americans, the almost like the witch hunt craze that seized the community of Salem, Massachusetts in 1692 and 1693 is a major one. And so I want to just briefly kind of talk about what occurs and then look at kind of how historians have tried to make sense of the events in Salem in the 1690s. So from 1692 on, there's a period of accusations where young women and older men are accusing also sort of younger women, some of them as young as 4, all the way up to sort of older middle-aged men of witchcraft, being a witch or so being a warlock if you're in the male version of that. And of course, this is happening in Massachusetts. So there's a degree of kind of Puritan thinking that's kind of preserved on from the 1620s. I mean, in some ways, this is the event that causes New England to be less Puritan in character. Some historians look at this moment and say this is I think one famous says this is the rock that broke theocracy in America. The ship of theocracy was broken upon the rock of the Salem witch trials, and basically, over a series of trials, you have 19 executions where 14 women and 5 men are convicted and executed as a result of being witches. And there are also, I think, a couple of individuals who refuse to confess and are tortured to death in the course of that sort of refusal to make a confession that they are a witch. One of them, I think, is crushed by like putting a board on him and increasingly weight of stone until the individual's killed as a result of that. And so, looking on sort of retrospectively, and maybe this will disappoint some of the listeners, there's a lot of sort of hand-wringing and admissions of sort of false accusations in later years. As late as 1706, there are women who were very young at the time, who are now middle-aged or even sort of maybe in their 50s, who are saying, "Man, I as a younger person, I made a false accusation of witchcraft here. That's something I want to ask forgiveness for." 5 years after the witchcraft trials, the sort of Puritans in Massachusetts hold like a day of remembrance and sort of like fasting and sort of repentance for the witch trial craze. But I mean, it was deadly serious what was happening at the time, and almost 20 people are executed, more than 20 people if you include the folks who don't confess. And so historians have really trying to wrestle with this and say, wow, what could have led to people killing their neighbors over stuff that broadly across Europe at this time is kind of increasingly being questioned. You know, witch trials are kind of on their way out. There's kind of a height in the middle of the 17th century, and they're sort of waning in Europe at this time. And there are a number of explanations for this. One of my favorite, and one that my professor, when I was a master's student at Ball State University, Dan Ingram, just loved to make fun of, was the idea that the Puritans in Salem were eating fermented grain and they were having hallucinations. And so as a result, they were going around accusing people and killing their neighbors. And that's probably not very accurate. One explanation that is, I think, kind of helpful to think about in the background of all the spookiness going on is it's basically a fight in the community. And so these people are being accused of witchcraft because they're on, at least initially, different sides of like a local political question. And that question is, how much autonomy should the small community of Salem Village have from the larger neighboring community of Salem Town? Salem Village has its own church. Salem Village has its own minister, Samuel Parris, who is in some ways leading the charge for autonomy. And there are two rival groups who are on different sides of this question, the Putnams and the Porters. The Putnams are kind of with Paris. They want more autonomy. The Porters want the community to remain sort of closely tied with Salem Town. And so in addition to kind of the spooky stories of people, you know, kind of baking poisoned cakes or, you know, sort of doing things that are you know, sort of in the realm of witchcraft, two scholars, Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissebaum, wrote a book called Salem Possessed: The Social Origins of Witchcraft, where they make this argument that it's really about this fight in the community. Because if you look at who's accusing people, it's the Putnam family, who's kind of loyal to the pastor. They want independence, and they're accusing their enemies of being witches. And so yeah, I do think to some extent, some of these accusers believed there was something odd and something spooky going on as they went to go accuse their neighbors and kind of get them killed. But there's also maybe like an underlying political motivation that's drawing this, or social motivation, kind of argument in the community that's driving this this story that leads to, in pretty horrific ways for a couple of them, almost 21 people being killed, either via sort of execution or killed in the course of torture. And so looking back on this today, I mean, this is the moment where, to a large extent in New England, the Puritan community says, wow, man, this was kind of on us. We maybe went a little too far here. And it helps explain why by the time you get to the Revolutionary War, there are still many unique characteristics of New England, even religiously kind of unique characteristics of life in New England compared to the rest of America. But New England starts to look less distinct and less Puritan as you move into the 1700s, and this is one of the reasons why.
What does happen to Salem Village? Is it incorporated into the town, or does it become independent?
That's a really great question. I don't actually know. I'd have to reread the book. I think it does become independent or more independent. But like, again, I need to sort of review the notes there to answer it with any degree of certainty. I mean, both are kind of swallowed up by suburbia today, obviously, but it's worth saying that the Putnams aren't the ones getting executed. And one of the criticisms of this interpretation by Boyer and Nissenbaum is that eventually the craze becomes so widespread that although it might have started as like this political movement, eventually people on both sides of the divide do get accused and do get executed as a result. So deciding to accuse your neighbors of witchcraft might be politically convenient in the short run, but eventually that's going to come back to bite you. So anyone thinking about doing that, please try to refrain this Halloween season.
Yes, let's not have that in today's politics. That could easily go badly. No, that was fascinating, Alex. I said as we were getting ready to do the episode, I'm familiar with this story largely from having to study the play The Crucible, which sort of ages half the cast up and decides it's all about sex. So it's interesting to hear some actual historical justification, explanation for what went off. I didn't have much joy finding ghost stories either. I've got a little bit which I'll come back to, but I can offer you French dragoons hunting werewolves. So I figured we've got some good military horror, and this might be again, as I said with the Crucible, this might be a story that people recognise through media. There's been a couple of films based on the story, which I'll mention at the end, but. This one jumps forward a little bit. So we're in the 1760s. We're in the mountains of southern France, in the area known as the Gévaudan, and the Gévaudan is increasingly stalked by a ferocious beast, like a wolf, yet not a wolf. For context here, wolf attacks in 18th century Europe on humans aren't necessarily a rare thing. It does happen, but this is something altogether more sinister. It's bigger, it's fiercer, and inevitably, as the attacks grow in number, it's believed to be supernatural. That it walks on its hind legs. It can leap great distances through the air, almost fly through the air. It can attack in multiple places at once, and then perhaps inevitably that it's undead and it can come back to life even after it's been shot. And it takes numerous victims, and the initial response is the local church, and we're pretty much in thoughts and prayers territory here. It's clearly been sent to God to punish the area for some unspecified sins. We need to pray and fast and think holy thoughts, and it'll go away. Doesn't work. Keeps going, and the word reaches higher authority, reaches royal authority. And so a troop of dragoons are sent to hunt it down, a Captain Duhamel and a troop of the Clermont-Provence dragoons, and they're sent down to hunt the beast. And they, I suppose this is give the army a problem, and they'll solve it in a good old-fashioned army way. So they massed wolf hunts on horseback, lots of dragoons charging about the place looking for beasts. And then they encounter it and they chase it and they try to shoot it, and it never quite happens for them. They aren't cooperating especially well with the locals, who are actually used to hunting wolves and think that this is a terrible way to go about it. They need to sort of stalk them and take them out rather than charging around the place and disturbing everything. They even try allegedly dressing some of the soldiers up as women, because most of the victims have been young women sort of out with the flocks. So yeah, French dragoons in drag as bait for werewolves. There you go. If nothing else is going to terrify you on Halloween, there's an image to chill the blood. But eventually, it's agreed that soldiers aren't perhaps the best solution to this, and that perhaps what is needed is professional wolf hunters. And the local wolf hunters are sent out with no more joy than the dragoons. And so the king sends his own top hunter, the arquebusier de roi, down to hunt the beast, and eventually he's able to shoot a very large wolf, which is believed, because of some of the scars that it bears, to have been the animal that has been responsible for the attacks. So, hurrah, we've killed the beast. It gets stuffed, it gets sent to Versailles to prove that the beast has been killed. But you'll recall I mentioned that one of the beast's supernatural powers is that it can strike in multiple places at the same time, and people have sort of calmed down a little bit and thought, yeah, or maybe there's more than one. So they keep looking, and sure enough, they find the she-wolf and a pup, which is already bigger than Mum. And they're killed, and another pup is believed to have been killed, but it gets away into some rocks and they're never quite sure. But hurrah, the beast is dead, the Gévaudan is safe. King Louis, the well-beloved, has saved the day and looked after his people. And then after a couple of months it starts again. And the king says, no, it's fake news. No, we killed it. My man killed it. It's dead. Nothing to worry about. Nobody's being eaten. And this is the official line from Versailles. And it actually takes the locals another couple of years. Whether there was another one, I mean, wolf packs, from what I know about them, there's sort of the alpha pair, and there's pups, and then there's sort of hanger-on wolves. So maybe there was another one. Maybe it was the pup that got away. But yeah, eventually it is also killed. And the question that has puzzle those who like to puzzle over such things ever since. What was it? And there are theories that it was an escaped lion from a menagerie, or an escaped hyena, or this or that and the other. One of the more convincing theories is it was a wolf or a wolf pack that had come up from Italy, where the wolves are sort of bigger and differently coloured to the ones that would be typical to that region of France, which certainly believable. I can't imagine it makes the news on your side of the Atlantic because you have rather more impressive top predators, but wolves making their way from Eastern Europe into Western Europe. I think there was one that came from Poland and ended up in Denmark or somewhere, so they do travel. But the other interesting thing from the one that was stuffed is that it had a double dew claw, which apparently is a mutation also found in some large dogs. So the other theory is that there could have been a wolf-dog hybrid, and maybe that's why they were so fearless around people. But that's the beast of Gévaudan now.
Can I ask some follow-ups, Andrew?
You can ask. I might not know the answers because that's probably most of what I know about the story. But
so, I think one of the themes that will come through. I mean, it's a military podcast, right? Hopefully, no one is shocked or spoiled by that. But the interaction between kind of these paranormal phenomena and the state, and so I wondered, as the French government clearly takes this seriously. I mean, they deploy military forces. The king sends his personal huntsman down to go and try to solve this mess. Is there a sense of how seriously the church and the state take the idea that this is a sort of a paranormal phenomenon, as opposed to just like, we've got a wolf problem? Or is the idea, these are wolves. We've seen wolves before. We just sort of know what to do.
I think there's certainly a sense that this is a wolf plus, whether it's a supernatural thing or whether it's been sent from God as a punishment, depending on which side of the religious standpoint that you come down. But I think there's a sense. I mean, I mentioned there's been a couple of films. I haven't seen either. I read the plot synopses, and one of those takes the line that there are various shadowy forces behind it. It's the Illuminati or the Freemasons or the Rotary Club or something of that sort, and it's an attempt to discredit the French state, and certainly it's the sort of it's the contract, isn't it? A king who can't look after his people isn't a very good king. So Louis got to step up and save his people, whether it's from a particularly ferocious pack of wolves or a supernatural beast. The end result is the same, which I think is why there's such a no. We've killed it. Our man killed it. We've done. I've done. The king has done what a king has to do. Saved his people. No, there aren't any more killings. Yeah, state line then gets followed because the state doesn't want to look silly. So
okay, interesting. Any sense of this is when exactly in the 1760s?
Oh, this is 1764. It starts, and 67, I think, the final beast is shot. But I say the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, it's really the locals have been left to their own devices because the official hunter has had his big kill and his big coup, and sort of Versailles lost interest after that.
Do you? So the 7 years was done. And where exactly is this in France?
So it's fairly south mountains, south central France.
Okay.
Is there still, like you mentioned, it was stuffed and sent to Versailles, and that you can tell there's still dew claws on it, or 2 dew claws. Like, can you go see this thing?
So there was an autopsy done. No, it's not been kept. They tried to keep one of the other ones, but it was very badly taxidermied and rotted. But no, I don't think the official beast that was sent back was kept. But this being the Enlightenment, a very scientific report was done in it to try and work out what manner of creature it was.
Hey everyone, Lee here for the Prime and Load team. We're passionate about exploring 18th century history and tactics and bringing those stories to you. But we need your help to grow our ranks. Please share this episode with a fellow history buff, leave a review where you can, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Most of all, join our email list. It gets you updates and insights into what's coming. You can join by using the link in this episode's description below. Thanks for listening, and now let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, that's another theme, right? Is the Enlightenment the state and the Enlightenment trying to deal with this with basically like folk culture and interpretations of these kind of events. Yeah.
Oh yeah, there's got to be a rational explanation, hasn't there? So yeah, science is applied, and superstition is squashed.
I did think, Andrew, you were saying when they take the stuffed beast back to Versailles, we know how it can rise from the dead, and then it just takes on the whole court, and we have an incredible revisionist.
There's a third film adaptation in there, isn't there? That, yeah, definitely. The beast rises again. The French court becomes werewolves. No wonder the revolution was necessary.
See, there you go.
We'll want werewolves to be disposed of. Goodness, yeah.
I like it. There you go. Awesome. Alex, you have another one in your pocket, don't you? Another story.
Yeah. So this one's very well known, but I'm hoping to maybe shed some more light on it, and of course, when we think about spooky stories and relation to early America and the Revolutionary War, what comes to mind is the legend of Sleepy Hollow and the Headless Horseman, right? And so, I mean, for those who, I guess, maybe slept their way through elementary school, this is a story written by Washington Irving, in which he's writing in the 1820s or in the year 1820, and he's describing fictitiously events in the 1790s, where after the Revolutionary War, a local schoolmaster, Ichabod Crane, is sort of chased out of town by a sort of ghastly apparition of a horseman who does not have a head. And sort of in his own social interpretation of this story, Irving, he sells it as sort of a supernatural, scary event, but it's also hinted that there's like a love triangle element where Ichabod and another young man are both vying for the hand of the same young, rich sort of heiress. And so as a result, the other suitor dresses up like the Headless Horseman in order to chase Ichabod out of town. But I want to talk a little bit about the Headless Horseman himself and kind of the background and inspiration that Washington Irving drew on in order to write this legend. Because to some extent, what he's trying to do here, because this comes out in the same like anthology, I guess we would say, of short stories as Rip Van Winkle, which is another kind of supernatural tale where a guy falls asleep for 50 years and wakes up in a new country. He's trying to give America folk stories similar to what's familiar in contemporary Europe at this time, sort of out beyond the purview of the state and the purview of the Enlightenment, what's really going on out in the countryside with the peasants. And so this tale of a horseman who sort of rides around and haunts his enemies without a head. He's sort of looking for his head in the story, right? This is actually a fairly common kind of German story, and it's first published in the 1780s by a German author who's describing the folk hauntings of a mountain spirit that he summarizes in a series of stories he calls the Legends of Rubizal. And this is in sort of the Sudeten Mountains. Sort of Breslau is the kind of nearest urban center, and he tells 5 tales of people who are kind of haunted or challenged by this kind of supernatural spirit, or almost like a mountain gnome that has magical abilities, named Rubizal. And one of these is a German, like a Countess Cecilia, who's traveling along in a carriage, and she's confronted by this apparition of a horseman who has no head. And much like Washington Irving set in the story we all know, why am I talking about it? Well, it's a Hessian veteran, and I'll come back to that in a minute, who's chasing people around with no head. Here in the German story, it's a headless veteran, but he's a veteran from the 30 Years' War, right? Who's sort of haunting people, and so they're sort of drawing on this story. And much like Washington Irving's tale, where you have Ichabod chased out of town by actually, the guy, the other suitor for his girlfriend's hand. The head that is thrown at Ichabod turns out to be a pumpkin. Well, here in this sort of legend of Rubizal, the sort of people traveling in the carriage manage to wrest the head of the headless horseman that's chasing the carriage. In their story, they take it to a local doctor, and what is it? It's a carved pumpkin. And so this sort of story of hauntings, sort of being chased by apparitions, the role of the pumpkin, especially carved in the likeness of a human face in sort of this time of the year. These are all things that Irving is drawing on as he sits down to write this story, sort of his take on American folk stories in the 1820s. Now, a few words about who exactly was the Headless Horseman, right? Let's suspend disbelief and say it's not what's the suitor's name, Abraham Van Brunt. If you need a big muscular guy to chase away a school teacher, what a name, Abraham Van Brunt. If it's not Abraham, if instead it's this apparition, who is this guy? Well, Irving describes him as a Hessian trooper, and if you have like a sort of like a Wikipedia level knowledge base of the Hessians in the American War of Independence, that may sound a little bit suspicious because the Hessians didn't send a lot of cavalry to go fight in the Americas. But here, Ichabod Crane is being chased around by this headless horseman. Some historians have looked at this and said, "Oh, it's probably a mounted Jaeger." I mean, the Jaegers ride, on horseback, but Jaegers aren't really troopers. And so this led me down a rabbit trail of trying to identify maybe which unit Irving had in mind, and the answer is, I think, Diemer's Hussars. There's a troop of about 40 Hessian Hussars that are raised from prisoners of war who have returned from Saratoga, and they're uniformed in sort of the traditional, busby and sort of coats of the European Hussars in the 18th century, and they fight in the area around New York City, which is where this tale is set. And so for Irving, who's kind of writing in the world of New York, he's trying to match up these stories about German legends where people are being chased around by horsemen who don't have any heads, and actually they're carrying pumpkins, with an experience maybe kind of similar to that in America, where you have German cavalrymen who are chasing around sort of American soldiers over here in the United States. It's not plagiarism, I don't think, but it's a great take on sort of a Germanic or even a Silesian folk story that's kind of come home to us in America.
Awesome. Maybe we'll have to find a picture of that unit or some amalgamation of a picture so we can get a sense of what are.
Yeah, that sounds right. So, I mean, it's like a micro unit. There are times when there are like 37 guys in this unit, but I will see if I can't find a picture of a similar hussar. I've been kind of as I suggested, falling down a rabbit hole. If I could just jump in with another on the Hessians real fast here. So when I was a master's student, I wrote my master's thesis on the Hessians, and I spent a lot of time reading Hessian soldiers' diaries. And one of because specifically I was writing about their relationship with Native Americans and African Americans, sort of what their views on maybe race were in the 18th century. And one of the things that I encountered in these diaries was the Hessians were kind of obsessed with the sky. They were obsessed with the planets, the movement of the planets, the natural phenomenon of the world. They record a lot of interesting notes about plants and animals here in America that they'd never experienced before. But when I was, like 23, working on my master's degree, one of the accounts that really stood out to me was Hessian soldiers on a march they saw a flaming object in the sky, and that flaming object followed them for a number of days before finally disappearing. And so as like a 23-year-old kid, I'm like, wait, is it like a UFO? Like, what's happening here? And I tried to find that story, and I couldn't find that exact description. But crawling through all my old notes and reading my old master's thesis, which was a spooky experience in itself, I found a reference in the diary of Andreas Wiederholt, who's a sort of a Hessian lieutenant captured at the Battle of Trenton, and he describes in 1780 seeing an object in the sky, and that object sort of hanging in the sky like unnaturally, not moving for a long period of time, and then moving off at great speed and leaving a trail of like smoke or like a visible vapor trail in the atmosphere. And he was like, it was a comet. We didn't hear any sort of like booms, like what we today think of like sonic booms, or like it hitting the ground or crashing the ground. And so I felt a little vindicated that, I just found a reference like this. And then I went to the footnotes section for the sort of the guy who compiled the work, and he was like, there are many references like this. UFOs? Question mark. And so one of the things that historians have dialed in on in the last 5 years in American history is the way that, for poor Brits like Andrew and people coming over from Germany, like in many ways, America is sort of this like an alien environment, a new environment, something that they have not experienced before. And so there's an excellent new book by Von Scribner called Under Alien Skies: Environment, Suffering, and the Defeat of the British Military in Revolutionary America. Where he looks at this from sort of like an environmental perspective. Like the Hessians are like, man, who knew Pensacola could be so hot? I never would have guessed this. But there's also, I think, from diary entries like the one from Andreas Wiederholt that I mentioned. There's maybe like a supernatural element to this. You come to America, you get spooked, and you see weird stuff in the sky, and so I think maybe something I'll be working on over the next year is trying to sort of find and compile all of these different references, because one of the great translators of Hessian sort of diaries over the last 30, 40 years, a man named Bruce Burgoyne, who's sadly departed now. He sort of notes, man, there are a lot of these descriptions of strange aerial phenomena in Hessian diaries, and so I guess like I'm left with the question: what's going on? Are these guys? Are you giving a little bit too much schnapps? At the end of the day, are you are you so intrigued by the the strange landscape that you're seeing things, or are Hessian military units actually shadowed by extraterrestrial flying craft in the course of the Revolutionary War? And honestly, I mean, I think any of these explanations are have equal weight in my mind. So maybe we'll have to see what happens.
Are there any accounts from non-Hessian troops that would tie to the same sort of phenomenon?
That's a great question. I've certainly looked for some in the past week and come up dry. It does seem to be a uniquely Hessian thing. But maybe maybe
I'm sure there's a very British explanation to that.
Yeah, exactly. Yikes! Oh no!
Did you say you had another one? Or?
Well, another kind of one. Yeah, I mean, I had a good look for ghost stories. And drew a blank, really. I'm sure there are some. It'd be great if listeners want to chip in with their military ghost stories that we haven't covered, and we can do this again in a year's time and tell those. But no, it did strike me in the looking that one of the things you do get is the ghost of deceased commanders coming back as a warning, very much as a literary device, rather than anything actually supernatural. So the Ballad of Admiral Hosier's ghost, he having led a failed expedition to the Spanish Americas and died of a fever, and when this is in the 1720s, and when Britain gets involved in that part of the world again in the War of Jenkins' Ear, the ballad has the late admiral return as a ghastly warning to the politicians who sent him on a suicide mission. Advice for Admiral Vernon, who's going off to do the same job, as to how he might do better. And similarly, the ghost of Admiral Byng, after he's been shot for not doing his utmost, is forever trotted out as a spectral warning to any commander who might consider not engaging the enemy more closely whenever he gets the chance. So yeah, it might not be the Hawke and Nelson school of getting stuck in to the French and the Spanish whenever you see one of their ships. It could in fact be the spectral admiral urging people on from the netherworld, but maybe not. But it's a nice literary device. But yeah, I drew a blank on actual ghost stories, so.
I could pop in with one. You see a very similar tradition in sort of German-speaking lands. In fact, it's how a lot of war reporting on the 7 Years' War happens. People who want to make comments on like the results of the past campaign frequently publish them in a sort of a genre of literature that I guess we would translate in English as like speeches from the kingdoms of the dead, like Gespräche in Reich des Todes, and this takes the form of like a general from either side who's been killed, kind of giving us their take on what's going on in the modern military situation. So there's one of these where, one of Frederick's right hand men in the 7 Years' War, Hans Karl von Winterfeld, is the sort of guy who's giving the well, this is what the Prussians would have, if I was still alive. This is what I would have done differently on the Prussian side. They're getting it all wrong. And maybe in a vein of like a more traditional ghost story, though, the Hohenzollern court in the 18th century does report seeing like a white lady. Whenever a Prussian king gets ready to die, the palace is sort of haunted by apparitions of a sort of ghostly figure. And so whether this is the Hohenzollerns are so evil, someone's coming to claim the spirit of the dying king or something like this, I think is unclear. But there are, in dribs and drabs, I think you find ghost stories. Now you had something for us, right, Lee?
Sorry, before we get on to Lee's, can I just jump in with something that's just occurred to me as we've been talking? I mean, Halloween, even when I was growing up in the 80s, wasn't a huge thing in the UK. Our let's all have a party in the autumn thing was Guy Fawkes Night, November the 5th, which obviously you guys don't have because it's commemorating something in British history. I'm just wondering, is the American Halloween that we all now know because American culture's gone global and we celebrate it just as assiduously over here these days, is that largely a German thing? Is that where it comes from into the American psyche?
No, I think
pretty much every story you've referenced has a German root somewhere.
Oh, that's just me. I think. I think it's an Alex problem. So no, I'm pretty sure, and I'm gonna butcher the Gaelic wrong here, but I'm pretty sure it's like Samhain. I think. Yeah. The beginning of the darker half of the year.
I say that. I mean, I get that it's the festival, that it's the Eve of All Hallows, and
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a religious thing. But no, the particular, you say the trick or treating and the pumpkins and all that, which I mean, I think a little bit of turnip carving in Scotland and parts of northern England, but it traditionally wasn't a huge thing. So I'm just wondering, does it come from German folk culture into America and then sort of back across the Atlantic as American culture becomes more dominant? This has got nothing to do with 18th century history. I'm just speculating here now.
No, yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure that I know the answer to that off the top of my head. I think it's hard. It really does come from like, it's like Devil's Night before All Hallows Eve, right? The idea is all the evil spirits get let loose right before all the good people come back to walk on Earth, right? I mean, that's not like a German or Irish or whatever thing. That's just like a broad Western Christendom kind of belief. I think that you have All Hallows Eve, and then the night before that is sort of when the wicked people are out doing their thing. I don't know how early that goes. Yeah, I'm not sure, Andrew.
Fair enough. It was literally just a thought that occurred as you were talking. But yeah, as Lee says, it's maybe your German obsession rather than any more than that.
There's nothing wrong with it. It's not an accusation or a value statement. It's just, an observation.
No, Alex likes the Germans. No, this is no.
I feel like you all are having fun at my expense here. Let's see here. Almanacs of the late 18th and early 19th century give no indication that Halloween was celebrated widely in America. It was not until after mass Scottish and Irish immigration to America in the 19th century that it becomes,
Anyway, Lee, we thought you had a story.
Yeah.
So I actually have two. One is historical and one's a little bit more personal, but they both kind of center on the same place. So I think I've alluded to it before at some point. Locally to me in the Niagara Falls area, there's a historic site, Old Fort Niagara, and during college I worked there, and I still do a lot of volunteering there. It's a wonderful place. So the historical one is historically not so spooky as a werewolf or UFOs, but it's kind of a crazy coincidence. So Fort Niagara in the 18th century is very much kind of the middle of nowhere. It's kind of the frontiers of New France and then of the British colonies. And there are many sources that talk about Fort Niagara being the last place anybody would actually want to be stationed, which is unfortunate because it's pretty today. And so at the beginning of the American Revolution, with the arrival of the 8th Regiment of Foot to take garrison of over the Great Lakes posts, or what's called the upper posts, is a man who is the lieutenant colonel of the 8th Regiment and is the commander at Fort Niagara. And I don't believe we know what he died from, but natural causes on October 31st, on Halloween, which is by itself a little spooky. But then later in 1777, Mason Bolton, the next lieutenant colonel of the 8th Regiment, he takes command, and he's another one of these historical figures who is very homesick. He writes back to England, requesting to go home, to take leave, go back to England, and he's kind of put off by the governor of Canada for a good amount of time. But finally, he's given leave to go back to England, along with a boatload of pensioners from the 8th Regiment who are going to be retired in England. And as many of us know, as Gordon Lightfoot has written about, that Lake Ontario is not a very friendly lake. So on Halloween of 1780, Mason Bolton goes down on the HMS Ontario, him and all the pensioners of the 8th Regiment of Foot. So these two deaths of commandants on Halloween, as I'm sure we can imagine, are the subject of a lot of kind of tourist folklore during the reconstruction of the fort in the 1920s. And so it's one of those spooky happenstances that have been used later as good tourist bait.
The key to spookiness right there.
Oh, it truly is, yes. And they have an event every year where they do lantern and lure tours, which are always a lot of fun. They go around and tell a bunch of spooky stories by candlelight at the edge of the wilderness, which is always a fun time. The personal story, like I said, I worked there while I was going to college. During that time, we were very fortunate to have a lot of very, very talented musicians. One of the guys was in a rock band, very, very talented musician, and then some other more classically trained musicians. And they always tell a story about how they were practicing one of their duty calls. I can't remember which one it was, but it was a duty call, and they were playing it on one side of the fort, and they could hear this echo that kind of sounded like a harmony with what one of the employees, what she was playing on the fife. And this other employee came out and said, "Oh, that was really nice. Like, I didn't realize you had Susanna on the other side of the fort playing a harmony." It's like, "Oh, well, we don't, there is no harmony to this particular duty call, and that's really interesting." It's like, "No, it sounds like somebody's over there playing." And then they forgot about it. And then a few weeks later in their research, they found a harmony to that duty call in some original documents, which was always kind of, again, a little spooky kind of harken back to musicians on the walls of the fort playing harmonies to duty calls. So
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I mean, I remember stories about a guy going around in a sheet with a billhook at Niagara, but maybe that's a scary thing of a different kind.
yeah, I think that one's more of a horror story, isn't it?
More of a horror story. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So maybe rounding us out here, I think some ways is like the premier, spooky event in the 18th century, something that originates in the 18th century, goes on down to the present day, and that's, where did vampires come from? And so I wanna walk us through what happens in the 1720s and 1730s and the Austrian military frontier, and maybe we can, you know, wonder exactly, why is this something that will go on to sort of be associated with Austrian lands in Eastern Europe, and blood sucking for the rest of the 18th century world. So in 1725, there is a man, and his name is given different his last name is given different ways depending on whether you're reading a sort of German source or someone who's trying to kind of put his sort of Serbian name into German, but it's something like Peter Baglovovich, and he dies, and then a couple months after his death, there are a rash of further deaths in his village, in what is today, I think, like northern Serbia. And the government's concerned. I mean, people getting murdered, right? Or at the very least are dying in unexplained ways. And so they send out a local government official to basically hunt this down, see what's happening. And his name is like Commissar, like Frumbold or something like this. And he's there. The peasants say, "Look, man, you don't know anything about this. You're not from around here. You're a German speaker. We know what's up. We've got to go exhume the body and sort of carry out a ritual execution, and then burn the body." And it's 1720. He's a relatively educated man. He says, "I don't know, this sounds like something the government would want me to do, but if that's what you think we need to do, that's fine. We'll go ahead and do this." And so they exhume the corpse, and of Blagojevic, the initial guy who died, and who hypothetically here is returning to bother the living. And Frumbold is, you can read his report today. It survives. He's pretty spooked. What rating is this podcast? Is this podcast like G rated? Like where are we drawing the line here? Okay. Um, I'll try to dance around exactly what I'm describing, but the corpse is exhumed. They make note of several odd features of the body. One of which Frumbold describes as the wild sign, which is a reference to arousal. Maybe listeners have some idea of what I mean. And there's also a lot of blood coming from the mouth, and the peasants are like, "See, this guy's a vampire. He's been eating people. The blood's coming out of his mouth." And Frumbold is kind of like, "I don't know, guys. Like, are we sure about this?" And they're like, "Yes." And so they stake him. They sort of dig the corpse up out of the ground. They burn him. And that is the end of this particular incident. That it's transmitted via report to Vienna. And it's kind of like a little bit of a cause celeb. It's like, oh man, there's odd stuff going on the military frontier. There's hauntings that are occurring. And at least initially, it doesn't appear like there's anything out of the ordinary. I mean, there are stories of unquiet spirits that go back in this part of the world, in Germany for hundreds of years. I mean, the German term like Nachseher, or like you want to call that as like revenant, or like a haunting that occurs after someone has died. That's something that is well known in German Central Europe at this time. Indeed, in like the 1530s. A local community is haunted by, you know, a Nachseher, or like a poltergeist, and some people come to ask Martin Luther, like, "Hey, what do you think we should do?" And Luther is sort of sitting there, you know, with his students, and is like, I mean, pray if it's demon possession, but like y'all are probably just really superstitious. It's fine, don't worry about it. And so like that is sort of the reaction, I think, of some, at least, to these stories. Luther advocates prayer and repentance, but throughout the German-speaking world, especially maybe in the sort of East Central Europe, there are continual tales of, you know, sort of hauntings, returnings, books that describe, you know, what do we do about the dead who return and sort of munch on the bones of the people who are in the graves. You know, this is maybe something more like zombies almost than vampires. Sort of fast forwarding back to the 1720s, in 1731, just, you know, 6 years after Beglogovich is killed, or dies and is re-killed, I guess maybe we would say. There's another vampire outbreak. In this case, it's a man. Sometimes his name is given like Arnold Powell. It's actually based on the research of a German historian named Thomas Baum, who's a really great book about kind of the origins of vampires. It's likely that this is actually a nickname, Arnut Pavel, which basically means like Pavel the Albanian. Because he's a guy who sort of hops on both sides of the military frontier. And again, this guy he falls off a hay wagon, dies, and then sort of comes back from the dead and is killing people in the village. Like 17 or some people are killed in this local village, or die shortly after he dies. And so, once again, the Austrian state government takes this fairly seriously. They send out a series of like military doctors to go and examine what's going on. And once again, the peasants basically say, "Hey, we've got to stake this guy. We've got to burn this guy. That will solve the problem." And so they do, and you know it does, at least for the time being. But this creates a huge like vampire controversy in like for the rest of the century in Eastern Europe. There are tales of vampires coming back from the dead and sort of sucking people's blood from the 1720s on all the way up into the 19th century and beyond. And so for Maria Theresa, who's a fairly enlightened woman, and for a lot of the people at her court, they're trying to deal with like, what do we do with these peasants who are running around digging people up and like staking them and burning them? Like this is not super sightly. This is not a sort of a great thing that we're experiencing here. They don't take the idea that sort of vampires are real very seriously. They think this is explainable through other means. But this is when even that term, sort of vampire, enters the sort of the common lexicon of European languages. Even in his letters, Frederick the Great says, you know, we've really got to, you know, be careful. You got to do this, or I'm going to come back like a vampire and haunt you. And so like it enters the vocabulary of sort of enlightened people, the sort of military world through the writings of these doctors. And so for the rest of the century, you have tales of people who are dying, potentially coming back, you know, kind of haunting the living. They have to be sort of challenged and staked as a result. And for a long time, historians have kind of struggled to say, where does this come from? where does this idea of the vampire, why does that enter our world in the 1730s, 1720s, 1730s? How do we go from like a time where like revenants are common, sort of ghostly as a poltergeist, that is pretty much established. Where do we get this idea of like blood sucking and this idea of sort of feasting on the living, coming back, sort of attacking the people you knew in life? And Thomas Bohn, this German historian who I reference, who sort of has written a book in the last 10 years about the social origin of vampires, actually thinks he's come up with the answer. And it's a less well-known example from just a few years before Peter Baglovovich was sort of sucking the blood of his neighbors, and that is a guy named Mikhail Kasparek, or Mihaly Kasparek, who's a, depending on who you believe, a Hungarian or a Pole who lives once again kind of on the fringes of the Austrian-controlled world, on the borderland between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the sort of the Austrian Empire. And he dies in 1718, but he comes back as like and not as like a revenant who's sort of there, sort of a ghostly apparition like we saw with the Headless Horseman. He comes back, and he's a Polish guy, so he's on horseback, sort of riding around. And he's sucking the blood of his victims, in addition to sort of committing arson and burning down their houses. And so Bohn argues that in some ways, these two pretty famous stories on the Habsburg frontier of Baglovovich and Arnold Pavel, they're maybe the start of this vampire craze, what we today have in like movies like Nosferatu, but it actually begins with this earlier Polish guy who comes back, is trying to get revenge on people who wronged him in life, and is kind of almost like a crossover or a missing link between Headless Horseman-esque stories and the vampire. And so it's something that goes on to have a pretty long afterlife in European history when we get to Bram Stoker's Dracula and things like that.
So if you want to see that HBO series, start contributing to the Buy Me a Coffee campaign. That's super cool. Murmurs in the Camp is a segment of our show where we answer questions and discuss topics that you, our listeners, want to hear about. If you have a question or topic that you want to submit to Murmurs in the Camp, call or text our Murmurs in the Camp voicemail box at 716-299-8426. That's 716-299-8426.
Hi guys, Jacob here, and I was wondering, how deadly was the bayonet? You hear multiple accounts of people surviving up to a dozen bayonet wounds. What's up with that?
And that's interesting. My mother-in-law she's the Niagara County historian. She has recently telling us about some accounts of an American soldier who was captured, who is wounded multiple times with a bayonet in the stomach, and then is left out overnight in the winter in December, and he lives to write about it. So that is interesting. So bayonets, what's up with that?
I mean, they are deadly in one respect. It's because it's a triangular blade. The theory, I think, is that the wound is harder to knit. You haven't got a clean cut that you can knit back together. I do wonder, just with your story, Lee, because I've read something similar, and I'm trying to dredge my mind as to where it was, but somebody surviving a pretty horrific set of wounds again in winter because the cold had the blood had clotted more quickly because of the cold, and made a wound survivable that perhaps wouldn't have been had the blood been flowing. But sorry, Alex, I think we both came in at the same time. You wanted to?
No. I was actually going to raise the exact point that you mentioned, which is among reenactors of a certain generation, you do frequently hear, "Oh man, it's a triangular wound. You're never going to be able to survive this." Anytime you get touched with a bayonet, it's a death sentence in the 18th century. And I mean, certainly, I mean, there are examples of people. There are examples of people who get stabbed a lot and survive. There are also examples of people who get stabbed a lot and die. I mean, ask poor Baron de Kalb down there after the Battle of Camden, right? He gets skewered a number of times. He does not make it. I do think, more seriously, kind of depends where you get hit and how bad. I mean, like Lafayette at the Battle of Brandywine, I think, gets stabbed through the leg with a bayonet, like through and through, and he has to recuperate for a while, but he survives. Right, and so it's not. I think to some extent it's kind of like a golden rule here. It's not like you get touched with a bayonet and you're insta dead, but also it is a serious wound and it's going to take some time to recuperate from, because it does take a long time to heal, because maybe the particular shape of the bayonet, right? I mean, the Lafayette is out of action for the next 6 months. He misses the Battle of Germantown. So there's serious wounds, but I think the deadliness of bayonet wounds has maybe been, overstated. I mean, it's not it's not impossible to survive these. You do almost wonder, though, at times. You read stories about Lee. What's the Peter Francesco? Is he the giant dragoon that everyone always talks about at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse?
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Yep.
He gets stabbed a billion times and he's fine. There's the gentleman who, I want to say it's in the course of Lexington Concord or Bunker Hill, is shot 3 times and stabbed a whole bunch, and he's 90 and he survives. Maybe then as now, if you're dealing with a serious injury, be it a sort of knife wound or a gunshot wound, your likelihood of surviving is probably going to depend on how quickly you get to medical care and whether or not that medical care is qualified at all. And whether in the 18th century, whether or not bad infection sort of takes in after you've gotten care. I will say, in the case of shrapnel and bullet wounds in the 18th century, frequently cloth is carried into those wounds, and that can be sort of a vehicle for infection. That's not something I think you worry about as much with a stab from a bayonet, because it's producing a hole that is fairly large and open, and it's not carrying things in with it. I mean, if it's stabbed into you, it's going to pierce through your clothing, not carry your clothing with it.
I mean, I wonder though as well. I think I've made this point before when we've been talking about things like the Highland Charge. The point of the bayonet, if you'll forgive a terrible inadvertent pun, isn't to poke holes in people as much as to frighten people into running away. All right, there are situations, storming a breach, house to house, fighting, street fighting, that sort of thing, where absolutely people are sticking each other with the bayonet. But by and large, it's a psychological effect, isn't it? And it's we've talked with Frederick the Great's ideas of advancing with shouldered muskets, and the sheer sight of the Prussian army will make anybody with any sense find that they've got a pressing appointment somewhere else. But if that line of soldiers then brings the bayonet down to the charge, and these sharp triangular blades are all pointing at you, then you might think even more that you've got a pressing engagement somewhere else. And if the idea is that, as it is, as you say, in reenacted culture now, that the bayonet wound is unsurvivable, then you don't want to, if you can at all help it, stay around in the open field and get into a bayonet fight. You want to be somewhere else. So, again, a terrifying weapon becomes a terror weapon. It becomes psychological warfare, and it's achieving the effect without having to be stuck into anybody.
Do you think that there's maybe a hyper awareness of this, with the idea, at least on this side of the ocean, the British used the bayonet on untrained American troops, and maybe that there's a kind of a leftover residue of this is so horrifying and terrible because it was used against Americans who, again, untrained troops who were afraid of it?
Yeah, I think it's possible, Lee. I do think that the cold steel is probably terrifying regardless of where you are. I mean, for the course of my undergraduate work, I transcribed the will of a British officer named Sir Robert Rich, who's there at Culloden, and he loses an arm and then a lot of fingers on his other surviving hand to sort of sword strokes at Culloden. And so it's pretty rough stuff, regardless of whether or not you're ready for it or used to it or not. I think also at the Battle of Landeshut in 1760, Baron de la Montfort is he's cut up very badly by enemy sword strokes and bayonet thrusts, but he survives. Maybe it's kind of Andrew said, the fear of it makes it seem like a terrifying weapon. The fact that these weapons are going to frequently disfigure you permanently, maybe in even a way that a gunshot would not. I mean, even an 18th century gunshot that's 69 caliber. A sword stroke that takes off your arm or takes off your hand is going to leave maybe a larger impact in your life than that. But I do think that, getting back to the initial question, which was, is it survivable? What's up with that? If you look at reports from hospitals, a really low proportion of troops are wounded by cold steel type weapons, so by swords or by bayonets. The vast majority of them are wounded by projectiles of some kind. And you could interpret this two ways as a historian. You could say, oh, look, all of the guys who got hit by bayonets are dead. Or you could interpret it and say, maybe bayonet fighting was not that common. And so I think for me, at least, I'm in the second camp. It's such a terror weapon, as Andrew points out, that whether or not it's survivable, you really don't want to do it. I mean, this comes back to Dave Grossman, the sort of combat psychologist. You sort of how do you actually get troops to point and shoot at things and sort of kill people? Not just sort of point around them. It's a lot easier psychologically to pull a trigger at somebody from 100 yards away than it is to shove steel into them. And so, for this reason, I think Andrew's very much on the right track. Bayonets are a weapon of intimidation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that even though they're very horrifying, you have no chance of survival. It's all comes down to where you get hit and how good the doctors are. I mean, it's kind of a sad state of affairs in the 18th century when the doctors aren't that great. But if you're the Baron de Kalb, you don't make it. If you're Marquis de Lafayette, you do. Would you say this is equally true? I know this is beyond our scope, Andrew, but like in the Napoleonic Wars, does these sort of conversations continue? Like, obviously you have the idea of like the attacks in column that the French do there as being a morale shock, but is there more fighting with hand-to-hand combat weapons on the whole in the Napoleonic Wars than in our period?
No, it's commented on when it happens because it's so rare. Again, outside of breaches, street fighting, the places where you are going to come to bayonet and musket butt, and again there are horrible survival stories of people coming back off the battlefield with arms and legs and noses missing and making I would say a full recovery, but going on and living reasonably normal lives afterwards. Obviously, surgery has begun to improve slightly by then, but we're still fairly basic. That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed us as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with the link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date with the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Ardi Son, and Adrian Beringer. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.